Hey guys, it's Justin with Shock Therapy, and today is a big day. It is the release of our new Billet race rack for a Can-Am X3. This rack has been in development for over a year, installed in over 20 different race teams' cars, thousands of race miles, and countless hours improving the system. We can tell you with confidence that this is the best rack that money can buy. So the reason that we developed this race rack for the Can-Am X3 is to try and cure some of the problems that are inherent in the stock car's rack and pinion. Some of these issues are feedback in the steering wheel, kickback in the steering wheel, going through rough terrain, having the wheel try to rip out of your hands, keeping control of the car with a death grip on both hands and having your arms fall asleep, finding that in a turn and in the whoops, the car will try and rip the wheel out of your hand as it goes through each individual whoop. From personal experience, I can tell you that if you drive the car all day long with a stock rack, you'll find yourself completely worn out at the end of the day. Our rack is going to change all of that. Those negatives, feedbacks, steering wheel kickback, worn out arms, having the steering turn on and off on you and the power assembly are going to be gone with our Billet race rack. In a stock rack, some of these problems are due to the fact that it has a round rack gear that the center link is attached to. So when you hit something big with a tire, it translates those forces through the tie rod into the center link and tries to rotate the round rack gear inside the body of the rack. When that gear rotates, it binds against the pinion teeth, it bows the rack gear, and then it binds against the bushings on the sides. When the rack itself goes into a bind, basically every single time the center link is hit via forces from the wheel and tire, it overloads the factory power steering. That APS unit is computer controlled and sees an overamp every time that rack and pinion goes into a bind. When it sees an overamp, it wants to protect itself by turning itself on and off in 30 to 40 millisecond intervals. While you're driving the car in a turn and hit whoops, you can feel that steering want to jerk out of your hand back and forth. That's a combination of the rack itself binding and the factory EPS trying to save itself by turning on and off. Our rack removes all of the factory rack issues. And since there is no bind in our system, the factory EPS does not try to turn itself on and off to protect itself. It also uses all the potential EPS power, and you will feel as if you have gotten more power steering assist with our rack in the car. So once you've worn out the factory rack and pinion, there's no point in putting on another stock one. It's just going to happen again. Some of the race teams have tried to cure this problem by adding a more powerful EPS unit to the system. Putting more electrical power or power assist behind the factory rack just succeeds in wearing out the factory rack and front end components faster. It may feel as if it is actually working for you. It doesn't have as much feedback in the wheel, but it creates more problems than it actually cures. Also, more powerful EPS units tend to require more electrical power, and the stator in the system is barely adequate for the car with a few accessories as it is, so that can tend to drain the batteries very fast. So what you're looking at on the bench is a factory rack and pinion out of a Can-Am X3. It's actually the rack out of my personal car. That rack has no comparison to our Billet race rack. We kept all of the factory bolt hole locations, angles and splines for the pinion, and pivot point locations so that all of the geometry in our rack is identical to the factory system. This rack bolts into the factory locations with the factory hardware very easily. So when you compare the two racks visually, it's very obvious that we've done away with the factory rubber boots that are common to leak on the stock rack and pinion. End caps and internal boots are gone. On our rack, it's a completely sealed system, so you don't lose grease, you don't have a potential for leaking. So the grease that's in the rack from us when we ship it is the grease that this rack is going to need for the life of the rack. Other things that we did was remove the multiple piece design of the factory rack. So the factory rack has different parts that can be separate and flex. That's also one of the negatives with the stock rack. It can flex inside the frame and break frame mounts. We've done away with that with a singular design, all billet aluminum, 7076 material. So there's no flex in this system. There's no multiple pieces. Keeps the system very, very solid and also makes the rack becomes a frame member and now supports the frame mounts instead of actually allowing the frame mounts to flex. So we've done away with the factory ball and socket design for the inner tie rod joint because these tend to break, are also a weak point in the system, tend to wear out after a race. We've gone to a rod end design on our center link so that you can adjust the system, you can replace rod ends as needed, but this design tends to wear out much, much, much less. Because we've done away with the factory inner ball and socket and gone to the rod end design, a set of tie rods are going to be required to install this rack in your car. So obviously you can appreciate some of the changes and improvements that we've made in the rack from the outside. But to honestly get an appreciation for some of the improvements that really make a difference, we want to go and look on the inside. Here on the table in front of me is a complete race rack disassembled with every component that we install in it. The main body of the rack is made of 7076 aluminum. This aluminum is a much higher grade than standard aluminum. It's nearly as strong as some carbon steels. The cost of the aluminum is about 4 times more than standard, but it's important that we have that in this rack for longevity and strength. All the aluminum components in this rack, main body, end caps, and other components, are hard anodized to eliminate surface wear and promote longevity. The rack gear in the rack is a rectangular gear. The reason this is important is because with the center link bolted to the rack gear, in the Can-Am rack, this is a round gear, which promotes a lot of the issues in the factory rack. With ours, it's a rectangle gear that cannot rotate or move in the body, which means the center link cannot rotate or raise or lower in the car. This single system is one of the main reasons why this rack has no feedback, no side loading, and no binding. The rack gear is made of 4130 chromoly material and is pre-heat treated to a Rockwell rating of our choosing. This is not a common thing when it comes to making rack and pinions. The reason is this material is already hard, which triples our tooling cost when it comes to cutting and machining the part. The advantage to using hardened material before machining is that this material stays perfectly straight. If we were to use this material pre-hardened, machine it and make it a lot easier on ourselves, and then heat treat it later, it bows the gear, which requires that we have a larger tolerance inside the rack body. That type of a machine process makes more play and less life out of the rack. By taking the time to machine this and basically ruin tools, we keep a straight gear, a tighter tolerance, and a longer lasting system. This bronze bushing in our rack is designed specifically to give the center link a lubricated support to slide back and forth as the rack is used. Over a period of time, if there's any component that would see wear due to use, it's going to be this bronze bushing. They're easily replaceable and just immediately make the rack brand new again. The cover plate for the bronze liner is stainless steel and is laser etched to locate the centering bolt in the rack. This centering bolt is used to hold the rack in the center position while you do your cycling of the front end and set your alignment. No longer do you have to have somebody hold the steering wheel perfectly centered while you do those things. The pinion gear in our rack is one of the largest pinion gears ever made. It's over 2 inches in length and gear contact surface. The pinion gear is made of 4140 and then heat treated to a 52 Rockwell. That is harder than a drill bit, making this pinion one of the strongest pinions on any off-road vehicle. The bearing that we use for the pinion is a high tolerance bearing. For instance, this bearing is about a $40 part as opposed to a low tolerance bearing that's a $6 part. All of the hardware used in our rack is hardened stainless steel so that we have no rusting issues from the outside or the inside over time. We use a stainless steel locking mechanism for the front center link bolts so that you don't have to use safety wire to lock the center link bolts in place. The center link and standoff plate are both 4130 material, but they have specifically been designed to give you adjustability in the front geometry of your car. When these parts are installed on the rack, there is a tooth locking design between both mating surfaces. This allows you to raise and lower the center link on the rack to tune the bump steer out of your car. This system is unique to our rack and unique in the industry. We also supply high tolerance machined shoulder bolts for this position. This keeps you from having any threads on one of the mounting tabs, which prematurely wear the system out. Another cool feature that's designed into this rack is a self-circulating grease system. Inside the rack body are grease grooves that feed specific spots in the rack. Every time the rack gear is cycled all the way and bottomed out into the end cap of the rack, that bottoming out process squirts grease from the end caps down these grooves and feed the center of the rack and feed the pinion and rack gear splines. In this way, this rack will continuously cycle grease from one end to the other, back to the middle, back to the outside, and back to the middle throughout its life. So now that you've seen all of the components that go into the inside of this race rack, now you'll understand a little bit more about some of the time, engineering, and component costs that go into the manufacture and engineering of one of these racks. There's plenty of ways we can make this rack cheaper, a lot less on the component strength, less on the plating, other items too. That's not the way that we build parts, and that's not the way parts should be built when it comes to racing and playing hard. Now, originally when we started designing this rack, we never intended to sell this to the public. We just figured we would build the best possible rack that you could ever build for our own personal race team and personal cars. But once we got into this development, we realized this is something that every single X3 can use. And a lot of people are running into the same problems that this rack cures. Now, the cost of this rack is $1,995. If you compare that to a billet race rack for a Polaris, which we manufacture and sell for $1,000. So strictly from a visual aspect, you can see that there's a lot more involved in the Can-Am rack. But to put a point to it, there is 5 times more cost in the materials for this X3 rack than there is on the Polaris rack. There is 4 times more machine shop hours in the manufacture of the parts on this X3 rack than the Polaris rack. So at $1,000 for this one and $2,000 for this one, you can start to understand where the costs come from, strictly from manufacturing this thing in the first place. Now, normally with race components, which this rack is, there's no warranty from anyone and any business. But with this rack, we're going to put our money where our mouth is, and we're going to offer a limited lifetime warranty on this rack. We feel so confident in its structure and strength, we know that you're going to enjoy it for longer than the life of your car. Rest assured that this is the one item that you will buy one time and forget. You'll have the confidence and comfort to be able to drive this car as hard as you possibly can without being worn out or having your hands fall asleep. I can assure you, as one of the engineers involved in this project, and also one of the test dummies involved in this project, that it will single-handedly change your driving experience for the better in your X3. Visit us at shocktherapist.com and or call us at 623-217-4959.